Okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome back to Statec Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers, and we also have Chiara Peroni online. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Martijn Hednriks speak about migration and happiness. But before introducing him, I have a few organizational items. First off, if you haven't seen the website, please check it out. You can see the upcoming schedule and past recordings presented there. For instance, our next seminar on the 2nd of February, we're actually going to look at the well-being of refugees. So it's a little bit more related to today's talk. Also, very important, we have our conference information up on the website. So if you're unaware, we are hosting an in-person conference on well-being this summer. It's going to be on the 1st to the 4th of June. We have a great set of speakers, a policy roundtable, and a workshop included. I'll spare you the additional details now. If you want to know more, you can send me an email or check out the website, which is wellbeing2022.lu. 2022 is numerals in numbers. The deadline for submission is the end of the month, so please check it out soon if you're interested. Enough of the advertising. So for today, I'd like to remind you that we are recording the event, and also to please keep your microphones muted during the presentation to keep background noise to a minimum. So Martijn will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end. At that time, please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. Then we will either read them out or you can read them out for Martijn to hear them. Now to introduce Dr. Martijn Hednriks. So Martijn is an assistant professor of happiness economics at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. He serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Happiness Studies and is an executive board member at the International Society for Quality of Life Studies. His work focuses on the causes and consequences of happiness, particularly in relation to migration, work, and economic behavior. Indeed, I do not know of someone who knows more about migration and happiness than Martijn. Although he completed his PhD relatively recently in 2018, he has published more than 10 papers on happiness and migration. His dissertation on migrant happiness received an award from the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, and today's paper builds on his earlier review of the topic, which has more than 100 citations in a relatively short period of time. Without further ado, Martijn, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Kelsey. And I'm going to tell you in these 40 minutes something about happiness and migration. Well, basically all what I've learned in the past 8 years working on this topic. So I hope that afterwards you will know as much about the topic as me. Well, almost then. Okay. Okay. So the content for today is based on a recent chapter I wrote together with Martijn Burger in the Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and Population Economics. And in this chapter, I address two research questions. How does happiness affect migration? And how does migration affect happiness? So basically, this is the bidirectional relationship between happiness and migration. And the scope of this seminar is a review of the empirical evidence on this topic. And we use a global perspective and cover outcomes of various stakeholders, such as the outcomes for migrants, the hosting communities, and family members left behind. And we focus both on international and internal migration. Well, let's first show you some statistics about migration. So currently there are 272 international migrants. So these are people living in a country other than where they were born. And this represents 3.5% of the world population. And this is up from 221 million in 2010. And the United Nations predicts that in 2050 we will have 400 million immigrants. So we see a quick increase. And now in Western countries, as you see in this map here, more than 10% of the population consists of international migrants, and in some countries like Canada and Australia, it's even more than 20%. But when we look at this question that you see here on top, So if you had the opportunity, would you like to move permanently to another country? Then we see that this number is far bigger. So more than 750 million people would like to move to another country if they had the opportunity. So this represents 15% of the world population, and this percentage is increasing over time. For example, 1/3 in sub-Saharan Africa wants to move to another country. But often these people don't move to other countries because of, for example, legal barriers, or because they don't have the financial means for it. Now moving to internal migration, so these are people moving to other places within country borders, we see that internal migration is far more common than international migration. If we take the example of China, we already see that within China there are 245 million people who move to another region in China, often from the rural areas to urban areas. So why do people migrate? Well, intuitively, we all know that there are some push factors, such as shortage of jobs, war, famine, etc. And some pull factors, so pull factors in the host countries, such as better healthcare there, more job opportunities, etc. Well, only 1 to 2% of the migrant population moves for reasons of war or famine or natural disasters. So these are forced migrants. So at least 98% of the migrants moves voluntarily. And these people, despite having all kinds of different concrete motives, they have one shared motive typically. And that is to improve their own lives and or that of their families. So how do we capture this better life? Well, it's now, especially in happiness economics, more common to capture well-being through happiness as a proxy measure. And here I give you 10 seconds to read this quote that is attributed to John Lennon. So in this quote, he nicely shows that we are often aware of our concrete motives to do things, but not our ultimate goals. And often happiness and survival are the two ultimate goals people have. So that's why happiness is used as a proxy for well-being. And intuitively, it also makes sense to migrate to other places, because here you see the World Happiness Report map of happiness. And you see that there are huge differences in happiness between regions. For example, you see sub-Saharan Africa is much less happy than the Western countries, especially. So for those who are less familiar with happiness, I will briefly tell you what I believe happiness is. So happiness is a synonym for subjective well-being, which is more used in the academic community. And both they can be defined as a person's subjective experience of his or her quality of life. And to clarify what this subjective well-being or happiness really is, we can start with global well-being in this scheme, so overall well-being. And then we have objective forms of well-being, such as wealth, life expectancy, employment rates, literacy rates, etc. And we have subjective components, so the subjective well-being. And this consists of two subcomponents, so the evaluative dimension, so how satisfied you are with your life, and the experiential dimension is how often you experience positive emotions and negative emotions. And in this literature that I'm going to show you all the evidence, typically 4 happiness measures are used. So first you have a life evaluation question. And this is simply one question asking people to rate their quality of life on an 11-point scale with 0 being the worst possible life and 10 being the best possible life. And we also have life satisfaction, very highly correlated with life evaluations, and that's simply a question like, how satisfied are you with your life? And then we have these two experiential dimensions, for example, how often people experience enjoyment, laughter, and happiness as forms of positive emotions, and how often they experience worry, sadness, and anger as examples of negative emotions. Okay, now I'm going to move to the question how happiness influences migration. And I want to start with one very interesting study about happiness expectations. And this study from Benjamin, published in the American Economic Review, shows that these evaluative subjective well-being expectations, so for example, life satisfaction, are the best, though imperfect, predictors of the chosen residencies of US medical students. So these medical students in the US, for their training programs, they need to to move to another city, but they can give their preferences where they would like to move to. And then you see that the places they want to move to are where they say they think they will achieve the highest subjective well-being. And these are better predictions of these preferences than, for example, future career prospects, location desirability, etc. Although there is no other migration-specific evidence available on this role of happiness expectations for migration, this pattern is consistent with general choice behavior, where there are more studies on this. So it is really interesting that happiness is a good proxy for expected utility. Now we move from happiness expectations to the much larger literature on the role of happiness levels as predictors of migration. And what the literature quite consistently shows is that people who are unhappier tend to have more migration intentions or desires. And also, when people are unhappier, they are more likely to return to their home countries. So when the migrants are unhappier, they have higher return intentions. And this gap is quite sizable. So these prospective migrants have about half a point lower happiness in Europe than people who do not aspire to move abroad. And this gap is 0.2 in Latin America. And interestingly, this fact that unhappy people want to move abroad holds after accounting for standard migration predictors, such as their objective situation, or for example, whether they have networks abroad. And another interesting thing shown in this literature is what Carol Graham calls frustrated achievers, is that these prospective migrants are less happy, as I just showed you, but they have higher objective success. So they are wealthier and better educated. So there's a contradiction here in terms of objective well-being and subjective well-being. And there's a plausible explanation for this, because unhappy people can probably gain the most from migration, but wealthier and better educated people have more opportunity to migrate. For example, because of these legal barriers that are higher for low educated prospective migrants. And this pattern of unhappy movers holds for especially for high income countries, but also for middle income countries. But for low income countries, it's a bit more complicated. So there, the unhappier people desire migration more, but intend it less. And these lesser intentions can be attributed again to the fact that they have less opportunities to migrate. So actually, in these low-income countries, to some extent, the happiness drain may occur because the happier people tend to migrate more. And these general patterns, they hold for international migrants, but there is also some suggestive evidence that they also hold for internal migrants. And in some studies on internal migration, we see that migrants experience a pre-migration dip in happiness. So in the 2 years before migration, their happiness declines. But the question, which is still unanswered, is whether this dip occurs because they will move, or whether this dip causes them to move. And it seems to be, based on the first evidence, that it's more the case that people move to overcome this dip. Okay, then we move to aggregate happiness levels, so on the country level. And we see that, and this is also consistent with this standard utility framework, that people tend to have stronger migration intentions when the happiness level is higher in destination places, and they have less intention to migrate when the happiness level is higher in the origin place. Then when we move to return migration, we see again consistent with this utility framework that if the migrants are happier in the destination, they have less intentions to return to their origin. But when the happiness level increases in their origin, they are more likely to return to that origin. So this is all, quite logical, but it's supported by evidence now. Then we move to the relative importance of happiness for predicting migration. And there we see that happiness levels, they are less important than some standard predictors, such as whether two countries have colonial ties or a similar language, or whether they share borders. But this happiness is more important than objective well-being indicators, such as the wealth level in the countries. So in this sense, happiness is complementary in predicting migration to objective well-being indicators. Okay, now I'm going to move to the question whether migration makes these various stakeholders actually happier or not. And for migrants, you might think that the answer is quite simple. And when you look at these country differences in happiness, you must say that if you move from, let's say, Haiti to Canada, you must become happier because of this large happiness differences between countries. But it is not so simple, because immigrants and natives may differ in various aspects. And one is their stable characteristics. For example, they might have different genetic structures that may have different influence on happiness, or the quality of nurturing when they were young might differ. They might have different objective circumstances, for example, a different labor market position in the host country, or migrants have less social networks. Also, their happiness functions may differ. For example, happiness depends for immigrants on additional factors such as ethnic discrimination, integration into the host society, language problems, etc. And we have these difference in the person location fit. So some people might simply fit better in a certain location based on, for example, religion, culture, language, etc. So now I'm going to move to a conceptual framework to see whether eventually immigrants become happier through migration. And whether they become happier depends on two things: this initial happiness shock immediately after migration, and how their happiness develops over time in the host country. And these depend again on three factors. One is the migration decision itself, so was it a good decision or not? On external factors, for example, how the economy of the host country is developing, and on migrants, their post-migration orientations. I'll come back to that in a sec. But let's first focus on this migration decision. And if we use this neoclassical framework of the Homo economicus, you would say that they will always make optimal migration decisions. But a large literature shows that it's not so easy, especially for migrants, to correctly estimate their outcomes, because they have limited knowledge about the destination. Often they have never been in the destination, so they simply don't know how it is to live there. And they receive biased information from the media or their personal contacts. For example, if they have another friend or family member already living abroad, these people might be inclined to positively self-represent their decision to migrate because they don't want to acknowledge that maybe their migration was not the best decision. So people tend to positively self-represent. And actually, these people might believe that they are better off because we have a cognitive dissonance bias. And also what works for one person may not work for another person. And then the second issue to make the right migration decision is to correctly weigh the advantages and disadvantages of migration. But it's not so easy because, as Daniel Kahneman has shown, we are all vulnerable to focusing illusions, which means that we do not always focus on the right things when making decisions. For example, we attribute too much weight to the weather or the economic situation, but not enough weight to, for example, the social situation that will await migrants after migration. And there are concerns about the outcomes of migration for migrants. There are stories in the literature about exploitation, homesickness, unsuccessful integration, and migrants may have excessive expectations. And I give you, again, 10 seconds to read this quote that is posted in the Ellis Island Museum that you will see when that is very close to the Statue of Liberty when you enter the US. So I give you 10 seconds. Yeah, so this is a clear example of these excessive expectations that occur. Sorry?
Georgiana, could you repeat yourself? Did you have a question? Oh, no, I think you're muted. Oh, okay. So it looks like you're waving us off. Okay. Martijn, go ahead and continue.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then we move to these post-migration orientations. I will not discuss these external factors because of time reasons, but post-migration orientations I will. So after migration, migrants typically experience a honeymoon period in which they compare themselves to the peers in their home country and their previous situation in the home country. And especially for people moving to more developed countries, their objective situation typically improves. So they are in a honeymoon period in which they believe their lives improve. But then over time, their reference point starts to shift. So they don't compare themselves so much anymore to the people in their peers in the home country and their previous situation in the home country, but more and more they will compare themselves to peers in the host country who are typically better off, especially for migrants moving to more developed countries, and their own previous situation in the host country. And this leads to upwardly shifting aspirations. And when these aspirations shift upwards, this can negatively influence happiness. So now I will discuss a bit about this happiness shock. So what you also see is that in terms of happiness, you first see this honeymoon period in the first few months. Afterwards, they experience culture shock, and then they adapt to that. So this is, again, this honeymoon period. When we look at this happiness development, we see here on this in this black line, and this is data for immigrants in Europe, we see a more or less flat line. So we don't see a clear upward or downward trend. But when we look at these perceptions of the host society, we see a clear downward trend. So the immigrants, the longer they stay in the host country, the less positive they are about the government of the host country and the economy of the host country, etc. So what we see is that over time, for migrants, objectively their lives improve when they stay longer in a host country, but subjectively they don't experience that their lives are improving. And to see the role of this downward trend, you see here that there's a complete zero effect of how long a migrant is in the host country on life satisfaction. But when we would control for this declining perceptions of the host society, we would see a clear positive trend because objectively their situation improves. Okay, now I'm going to review the real evidence on whether migration makes migrants happier. And first I'm going to show you what is the best global evidence available so far. And here I will first focus on the purple bars. In this first purple bar, so these are all immigrants, we see that migrants after migration evaluate their quality of life 9% higher. So we see the average migrant in the world clearly benefits from migration in terms of life evaluations. When we look here at this bar, this is positive effect. We also see that they experience 5% more positive effect. And when we look at negative effect, they experience 7% less negative effect. And that's a good thing because you want to experience less negative emotions such as sadness and depression, etc. So all three indicators show that on average, migrants clearly are better off after migration. Now, when we distinguish between newcomers, so these are people who arrived less than 5 years ago, and long-timers, people who arrived more than 5 years ago in host country, we see that the bars are very similar. And this leads to the conclusion that the full happiness gain from migration is already achieved in the first 5 years after migration, so in this happiness shock period. Now we look at some differences between regions. Well, it will not be so surprising that the biggest improvement of all these migration flows that we investigated is from the least happy region in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa, to the happiest region, Western Europe. So we see for them almost a 30% gain in life evaluations. But we also see here two migration flows in which we don't see an improvement. These are people moving from Latin America to Northern America, Australia and New Zealand. That is this is a really interesting one because Latin America is actually a much happier region than you would expect based on their development situation or their economic situation. So Latin America typically has a happiness premium. And we also see no positive effects from Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. So what this shows is that in most migration flows, we see positive effects, but not in all. And when we look at migration outcomes for migrants within regions, so for example, a person moving from one country in Southeast Asia to another country in Southeast Asia, we also typically see positive effects, especially in Southeast Asia, but that's mostly because we have China and Hong Kong separately, and these are Chinese moving to Hong Kong, but also in the other regions. But here also we have two exceptions, South Asia and Northern America, Australia and New Zealand, showing again that for most people, migration improves happiness, but not for all people. When we look at other studies, we see very similar patterns. So people moving from developing countries to developed countries, they are better off. But we see that people moving from developed countries to developing countries, they might experience negative effects. And to show that there are negative effects possible, this is the best evidence available so far is experimental from Tongans moving to New Zealand, and there was actually a negative effect. Now, let's look at the convergence. I'm going to explain you this graph. So on the horizontal axis, we see how much migrants gained in terms of happiness from their migration. And on the vertical axis, we see the happiness difference between the origin and the destination country. What we see is that there's a really high correlation of 0.8. So migrants moving to happier countries typically become happier themselves. And interestingly, this happiness gain experienced by the migrants is more strongly correlated with this happiness gap that I showed you than with the development gap, so the Human Development Index gap, and the wealth gap, the GDP per capita gap between these destination and origin countries. So it's not necessarily that moving to a wealthier country makes you happier, but more often moving to a happier country makes migrants happier. We see also this positive convergence for these other two happiness measures, so positive effect and negative effect, but the correlations are much smaller. And that's because with emotions, people are much more resilient in their emotions than in their life evaluations. Now, moving to internal migration, it will not surprise you that the literature shows that the impact of migration is smaller for internal migrants simply because their circumstances change less. Positive effects are typically seen in developed countries, such as internal migrants in Germany, the UK, Australia, and Sweden. But negative effects are seen for these rural to urban migrants in developing countries. And this can be explained by various reasons, such as the social comparisons they make to these richer urban residents, their lower social status in the cities, leaving family and friends behind, especially in the hukou system in China, the institutional discrimination for these rural to urban migrants, and they often end up in 3D jobs. Okay, now I'm going to move away from the migrants and I'm going to focus on their family members that they left behind. So there are millions of migrants that have left family members behind in their home countries, and they often move by themselves to another country to support often via remittances, the well-being of family members and others. And often, or possibly, they sacrifice their own happiness to give their family members a better life. And this may be one of the reasons that some migrants do not become happier from migration. So often their migration might lead to better economic well-being for their family members back in the home country, and that might improve happiness. But on the other hand, it leads for these family members back home to a disintegrated family, and that might reduce happiness. So it's a question what this adds up to.
Martijn, we have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, okay, I'm quite far. Okay. Then, yeah, to look at these global outcomes in the world, we see that typically these family members left behind, their life evaluations increase by having a household member abroad. Their positive effect increases, but also their negative effect increases. So they experience more sadness, depression, anger, etc. So we see here mixed results depending on the indicator of happiness. And when we distinguish between those moving abroad for temporary work and those moving permanently abroad, we see similar patterns. So life evaluations both increase, while only negative effect increases for those with temporary work. Then when we further zoom in, and now we're only focusing on Latin American migrants, on those receiving remittances, we see again a similar pattern, but we don't see any more negative effects. So this remittances can be an important moderating variable in these effects. Okay, when we look at these outcomes by regional migration flows, we see that the gains are larger for migrants moving from developing to developed countries. That's not so surprising because those are the ones that often send back remittances. And we don't see any reduced negative effect in any of the 21 considered migration flows. So in no case, these family members left behind experience less sadness, anger, etc. And studies on internal migration show a bit of a different pattern, but these are focused mostly on the left behind in rural China, and there are sometimes negative effects are found. Okay, now the final group of stakeholders are the host communities. And there are concerns in the host countries about the consequences of migration. For example, when we look at Europe, we see that more than half of the people want immigration to be decreased. And this is a nice figure by our host, Kelsey, showing that immigration and terrorism are the two biggest issues facing the EU, as evaluated by EU citizens. This was in 2017 before Corona, but it clearly shows the worries about immigration in Europe. So what are the happiness consequences for the host countries? Well, in Europe, generally, the literature shows no effect. And this also holds for specific subgroups, for example, the poorly educated, and also for migrant subgroups, for example, refugees. But then a recent work showed that a positive impact is generally experienced in Northern, Western, and Eastern Europe, but a negative impact in Southern Europe. So there might be some heterogeneity. We also see in the UK that there's also no real effect on the host communities, or a negative effect. And this negative effect is experienced by groups that also voted for the Brexit, such as older, poor, lower educated, and unemployed individuals. In Germany, we see a no or a positive effect. US, Australia, negative effects. But the important thing is, regardless of these directions of the effects, all the magnitudes are really small. Only really large migration flows would influence the happiness of host community members substantially. Okay, then my final slides are my conclusions based on this whole literature. So to wrap up, we see that relatively unhappy people move to happier places, and we have some initial evidence that happiness expectations may be among the best predictors of migration. And we also see that migration may contribute to a happier world because most international migrants gain happiness from migration, while the hosting populations experienced a mixed but very small impact. Family members staying behind experience a positive impact on evaluative well-being, but not on emotional well-being because of this discrepancy between negative and positive effect. And the impact of migration tends to be smaller for internal migrations, but of course, most of what I've discussed are averages, and we need to keep in mind that the outcomes are strongly context dependent. And finally, some policy implications. So international migration is for many people a powerful instrument to improve their lives, but not for everyone. We have seen some migration flows in which this was not the case, and there could be some support for, especially in these migration flows, to develop realistic expectations of migration. And another policy implication is that the major concerns in immigrant receiving countries about migration are not in line with the small effect of immigration on societal happiness. That does not mean that we should open all borders, because if there would be really large influence of migrants, this relationship might, of course, change. But for now, with the current migration trends, it has very small effects on societal happiness. For policymakers who aim to reduce out-migration from a country, they should not only focus on improving the objective well-being of citizens, but also their subjective well-being. And finally, migration can reduce happiness inequality around the world, because these migrants from developing countries typically become happier in developed countries, while those left behind in low-income countries tend to benefit the most as well. So yeah, that was all I learned in these 8 years of work on this topic, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Martijn, that when you say all that you've learned, this is huge and a very nice summary. I benefit greatly from seeing it. We have quite a few questions in the chat already. So I think to speed things along, some nice questions. So I'll just get started. Elena asked the first question. Does the happiness premium depend on the inequality in the happiness at the origin or destination country? That's our first question.
Good. That's a very interesting one. Let me think about that. I'm not aware of any good research on that. But intuitively, I would say in terms of correlation for sure, because like low developing countries tend to have higher inequalities in happiness, but in terms of the causal effects, I don't think there's good research on that, to my knowledge. So maybe it's a nice project from Milena also to do.
She responds basically saying exactly that. She was curious that she didn't know, so also why she asked. Okay, moving on to Magdalena Sofia, and she's got kind of two questions that are related. So she starts with the preface, I might have misunderstood, but you first said that over time, immigrants' lives improve objectively, but not subjectively. And then you show evidence that second piece, after migration, migrants evaluate their quality of life 90% higher. And then she's wondering if this is contradictory.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not contradictory, and I will show why. So this is the relevant graph here. And we see that this increase in happiness is already achieved for these newcomers, so these green bars, so people who moved less than 5 years ago to the host country. But afterwards, so for the long timers, people who stayed more than 5 years, they don't see a further increase in happiness. So you see here that at least after this initial period, there is a null effect between time since migration and happiness.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So initial boom, but then afterwards, no further adjustment. And then Magdalena has a question, another one, and it's similar to Ansha's, asking about which data you used, both for subjective well-being and migrant populations over time.
Okay, so most of the evidence in the graphs that I showed here is data from the Gallup World Poll. And the specific measures are, well, the ones that I listed somewhere at the beginning of my presentation. Here you see them. So the life evaluation, so the question, and these positive and negative effect questions. I also discussed some findings from other studies, and of course these are they're often based on these kind of life satisfaction questions. In terms of migration, the data, so a migrant is defined in terms of people's country of birth. So in these social surveys, people just indicate whether they are born in the country where they currently live, if not, in what country they were born. I hope that answers the questions.
And I think you often use, let's say, United Nations Population Division, right, for data on immigration flows if you're looking at the country level.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So for the size of migration flows and stuff, I use United Nations data.
Okay, great. We have a question from Christopher Ferreira, and he wants to know who the target, there's a couple parts to this, who the target group on which you base your calculations on. So he's thinking, for example, working people versus people in general, and he thinks that there may be a big difference in happiness level gains from Central Western Europe to South Europe if you compare workers and retired people. Also, he assumes that migration has an initial negative impact for children and teenagers. And then he wants to know if there's any data on differences of happiness gained based on whether a person is, different personality types, say like an extrovert or an introvert, given that outgoing people usually make friends easier, and he assumes social contexts have a positive impact on happiness.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let me answer it question by question. So the target group, well, what I show here is mostly people in general. So I include everyone in the samples. And that's also what most of the other studies that I discussed tend to do. But yeah, sure, there are differences based on specific socio-demographic characteristics and migration motives. Specifically for those moving to South Europe, it might be true that retired people might experience higher happiness gains from that. But there's no specific research on that. But what I want to stress is that in this presentation, I mostly talk about averages because I don't have time to really make all these different distinctions that are made by these studies. Yeah, children, it's interesting. There's not good research on the real impact on children and teenagers. So there is some research now on the happiness gaps between immigrant children and native children, and we generally see quite similar patterns to adults, so that the immigrant children tend to be a bit less happy than native children, but to a lesser extent than you would predict based on the happiness level in their origin country. So while there's no good evidence on it, I think that if we would have good evidence, we will find that also these children and teenagers would experience happiness improvements by migration. Okay, data on this one. I haven't seen really good data on this specific distinction between extrovert and introvert people, but also intuition, well, tells me that extrovert people, they will be better able to rebuild their social networks. So I think if we would have good data on this, we would find that the consequence would be better for extrovert people, but this is pure speculation again. France easier. Oh yeah, that's also, yeah. Yeah, so that's what I just mentioned. Yeah, okay. Then we can move to the next question.
Can you see them, Martijn, or?
Yeah, I see the questions.
You see the chat. Yeah. Okay. Maybe if you want to, feel free to read it out yourself. Then we'll just move on to.
Okay, then I go.
Thanasis Zeogus.
Yeah.
Sorry, I pronounced that name wrong.
Okay. Does the age of migration, in terms of exposure at the place of origin, is a significant predictor of happiness? Okay, so this is again like a moderating role of the age of migration. That's a good question. He says, I guess it's different to leave your place of origin, for example, at the age of 40 compared to the age of 20. Desires are much stronger. So I also suspect that at the age of 20, the consequences of happiness are more positive, but no research comes to mind that really explicitly checked this. So maybe also a nice research project for Thanasis.
To undertake. Very nice.
Yeah. Okay, Antje. Okay, the graph on slide 26 shows a fairly constant level of life satisfaction, and at the same time a decreasing perception of the host society. He said that for this reason, migrants do not subjectively experience their actual level of life satisfaction. I have two questions about this. What does perception of host society mean? Okay, let me first answer this one. So perception of host society is here how satisfied you are with the government, the economy, the institutions in the host country, and how much you would trust these institutions. Yeah. And how can a subjective self-reported measure of well-being not be subjectively experienced? Or did I misunderstand something? Okay. So the thing is that life satisfaction, of course, is a subjective experience, but it depends not only on these perceptions of the host society, but also on, for example, a migrant's objective situation. And while a migrant's objective situation tends to improve over time in the host country, we see that their perceptions of the host society decrease over time. And when you add these two things up, you get a null effect on life satisfaction.
Martijn, I just had someone ask you, can you move us to slide 26 real quick for us just to see this? Is that possible? Yeah, great. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so you see a zero trend in life satisfaction and declining trend in perceptions of the host society. And why do these directions contradict? Well, that's because if I simplify it, one major factor is missing, and that is the objective situation. For example, objective income levels of these migrants, and these tend to improve over time. So if we would draw here a line of the objective situation of migrants, you would see an increasing line.
I think that makes sense. You showed us in the regression table. I think it was 2-3 slides afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems to correspond nicely.
Yeah, so we see a null effect, but if we would control for this one mechanism, these declining perceptions of the host society, we would actually see an increasing life satisfaction trend, because this captures mostly this improving objective situation of the migrants.
I have a related question to that. So I remember learning previously that migrants typically catch up to natives in objective characteristics, let's say like education and income, maybe even in some cases wealth levels. Do you have a sense of how long it takes? I imagine it varies quite a bit from country to country, but is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Do you know if there's an average number?
I don't know about an average number. I do know that there's a lot of heterogeneity in there. So you have people who integrate quite successfully, but also you have a group that really segregates, and this is maybe 20 to 25% of the immigrants that actually does not progress in terms of their objective situation. But for this kind of 75% that does, well, the time it takes them to catch up, I don't know the exact answer, but it will be, I think it will be more like decades than a few years.
Okay, that's already quite informative to know that, say, 25% doesn't. And we're sitting at 6 o'clock, so thank you everyone for attending. We still have a few more questions, Martijn, if you don't mind. We'll go a little bit over. So we handled Ansha's second question here, and then so the next person looks like John Robertson on slide 30.
Yeah. Okay, migrant subjective. I will read it out loud. Okay, on slide 30, migrants. Well, let me go to slide 30 first. Okay, so this is between regions, the outcomes for migrants. Migrant subjective well-being outcomes from Western Europe to Eastern Europe is detailed as negative. May I ask which study this is from? Okay, so this is based on the Gallup World Poll data. And it's the same data as this general graph I showed you here. And now we just distinguish between different migration flows. So this is Gallup World Poll data. These are life evaluations and first generation immigrants.
Have you published this? Is this something that we can go and find online, or?
Yeah, sure. So everything I discuss, you can also find in the book chapter. But this specific study is a chapter of me and my co-authors in the World Happiness Report of 2018.
Great. Thanks.
So if you Google World Happiness Report 2018, you will see my name, and then you will see this graph as well, and a detailed explanation of the study.
We have a question from Eduardo.
Yeah. Do you think we could say something reasonable without considering the whole migratory experience of migrant? Do you think we could say reasonable?
Eduardo, if you want to unmute yourself, maybe you can clarify your question.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you for your presentation. I was thinking that we have not the vital experience of migrants. So if they feel happier or less happy, it depends of the whole experience they have had from the origin country to the destination. So analyzing only independent, isolated variables is very difficult to say if a person, after going through this so important experience, is very difficult just asking then are you feeling happier now or not? But we don't know nothing about the whole experience of migration. So we need contextualize this data just to make strong statements about what it means the migration process. I just want to know your take on this kind of needed knowledge of the experience of migrant, not only quantitative variables.
Yeah. Okay, so I think you're also. Oh, sorry, I hear myself.
Eduardo, can you mute now, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think Eduardo is specifically interested in the mediating mechanisms that that lead to the consequences we see here. And what we generally see is that one quite problematic aspect for most migrants moving to developed countries is that there is a large negative impact of the social environment in the host country. Often they are not really seen as how to say it, not treated the same as the natives, and they experience hostility. And from some research, we have learned that this really has a large negative effect on the happiness consequences for migrants. And of course, on the individual level, we also see that there is this large issue of them leaving behind their social networks. Migrants tend to be much lonelier, much less social support. But on the other hand, the increases in happiness are mostly caused by these improved economic conditions, the improved quality of institutions in these more developed host countries. For example, less corruption, etc. And for example, for younger people, the better educational outcomes. So yeah, these are in my experience, the most important mediating mechanisms there. I hope that answers the question.
Martijn, if I may, related, are you aware of any data that track people's say before and after. So I imagine the panel data set across countries is not really existent, but maybe there's some qualitative studies that, can, provide some of what Eduardo was thinking about. And so you may miss, I think you know where I'm going, some of the quantitative aspects, but it fills in some of those, some of the story behind the numbers.
Yeah, there is qualitative evidence. The issue is that this qualitative evidence are often case studies, and these case studies tend to focus on negative outcomes such as homesickness, exploitation, and those kind of things. So there is qualitative evidence, but it's not very balanced. It's often, yeah.
Okay.
Researchers start to become interested in such a case study because they know that there are some things going on that are not so great.
Yeah, understood. And then I think Joel Mikado, and I think we have 2 more questions after that. So Joel Mikado's next.
Okay. Are you aware?
And maybe we should, after these questions, we'll have to shut it down, I think.
Yeah. Are you aware of research on how the difference between before migration subjective well-being expectations and realized subjective well-being affects migrants' behavior, including selective return migration? No, there's no data on that yet. Again, the real issue in internal migration research is that there are no data sets which follow people before migration and after migration. So there is maybe some case studies, but not really good social panel studies. So yeah. Okay, then I move to the question of Christoph. Is it safe to say that from all this data, economic wealth of the host country is the most important factor for the increase/decrease in happiness? Or do social aspects play an as important role? Economic wealth. No, so yeah, what I also showed is that, for example, the wealth difference between the host and home country has a correlation of 0.62 with the gain for migrants in terms of happiness. So, of course, moving to a wealthier country makes migrants happier, but it's really not the most important factor. Especially these social aspects that I also discussed about, for example, the hostility that immigrants experience in the host country, those tend to have at least as large an effect on happiness than these economic indicators. So yes, economic wealth is important, but it's not everything. Well, I'll do the last question by Antje. Isn't trust in government a part of what I take into account when evaluating my life as a whole? Does it make sense to put both into a regression model? Yes, trust in government you take into account when evaluating your life satisfaction. But it's the point of the regression model I showed is that life satisfaction is a dependent variable, and trust in government is one independent variable, but life satisfaction depends on many more things than just trust in government. So when we control for trust in government, we will actually see that migrants become happier over time. But in reality, migrants do not become happier over time because of their declining trust in the government. Should I do the one of Chiara as well?
Yes, Chiara is our real host, so it makes sense to pick her up. So
okay.
Yeah. So I guess, is that, yeah, okay.
So it shouldn't be rather the quality of the welfare state could explain this overall result of slide 30. Quality of the welfare state. Yeah, definitely the quality of the welfare state plays a role here. So we generally see that the happiest countries are the countries with a better welfare state. Yeah, immigrants also, because of their vulnerable situation, will really benefit from that. It is important to mention for me that ultimately immigrants contribute more to the economy of the host country than the social welfare that they use. So that's something I want to have mentioned.
Just to clarify this, Martijn, so Western Europe, does that include the Nordic countries, or are the Nordic countries really treated separately here?
No, Western Europe includes the northern countries.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you were to separate that out, that would be maybe a helpful distinction to see if it's just wealth or, you know, something else driving this. And Chiara clarifies here, you can see. You know,
yeah, maybe Northern Western Europe would have been better. Yeah.
Education, healthcare provision, among total factors, among the other factors. Education, of course, really only affecting the youth, but yeah, I think your response still stands.
Yeah, so it's all these different conditions: social welfare, education, healthcare, etc. They all contribute to this this increase in life satisfaction. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll close it here. So we've taken an extra 15 minutes of your time. I very much appreciate those of you who have attended and asked us some great questions. Appreciate that a lot. And Martijn, thank you quite a lot for this. This is extremely informative and interesting topic. A great way to get us started for the new year.
Yeah, thank you all for attending.
Thank you. I will close now. Have a great night, everyone, or morning for some of you.